You know, I've said a few times that this show is basically the Clone Wars too, but I didn't mean it quite that literally. No, no, no. One of the things I find amusing is that they're still salvaging Clone Wars tech and supplies and munitions 15 years on. Now that makes sense. Oops. As I mentioned earlier, the sheer scope and scale of the Clone Wars was so gargantuan, it makes sense that that many things would fall through the cracks even over a decade later. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of that whole, ancient precursor thing, except it's not really a precursor, it's just the incredibly wasteful way the Republic did things. There's this bit where they mention the droids don't look very dangerous. Yeah, no, I remember the Clone Wars. Those droids weren't very dangerous. Although it is funny to me how much more capable and deadly the destroyers were. Two destroyers were than like 30 actual battle droids. Just whatever. I also like that one statement, though. What's ray shielding? I know that I've talked before, even in defense, of the nature of how Star Wars technology kind of does this. There's a lot of ups, and then there's a lot of downs, and there's a lot of ups, and they actually lose tech over time. I'm not quite willing to defend the fact that everything looks better in the prequels than it does in the original trilogy, but at the same time, it is interesting that they would literally have lost ray shields like that. I mean, think about it. When was the last time you saw a ray shield actually be used? So, I've talked many times about droid effect and what it means. This might be one of the only examples I've ever seen of droid effect happening, but not fully. So, droid effect, some people think that it means a sufficiently advanced mind will always develop sentience and sapience, but that's not true. In the same way, and I hate to bring this up yet again, but this is a real life thing. If you put a newborn child out in the wild and it somehow survives, that kid will not really be fully sentient or sapient by the time they've gotten to the point where they would be normally, because the other critical component is experience with other beings. That social interaction is necessary for our development process. And it's the same thing with droid effect, a sufficiently advanced technology which has repeated regular interactions and experiences with others to then develop based off of. Now I mention this because our tactical droid here does have other beings to interact with, just like the other droids do, but it's just droids. So what we have here is more or less literally an echo chamber in a societal way, in a cultural way. Now, usually that term is used as an insult, and with good reason, but in this case I find it to be a fascinating cultural point, because these droids have functionally been they've got a plateau, a ceiling on how well they can develop and how far they can go, because all they have to build off of each other is each other. And thus that makes sense why, as is mentioned several times in the episode, the tactical droid is so limited by his programming. Because he just can't go any further, because he had nothing to really bounce off of in order to develop further. Now, here's the catch. The episode makes several extremely obvious, blatant references to the similarities between Rex and the tactical droid. But I think this is the best example between the two, because if you remember, Rex, for the last 15 years, has mostly been with his fellow clones. Just like this tactical droid has been with his fellow droids. For better or for worse, even though I would argue that both have the capacity for true sentience and sapience, both have been limited in their progression and development, societally and culturally, by that echo chamber effect. Now, Rex has recently rejoined the rebellion and started really interacting with others, and that's helped him. And of course, he did have experience with the Jedi back in the day, so that helped him. But you could see how both groups were limited because of the machinations of the Clone War, which consequently is one of the major themes of this piece in general. There's actually a really great scene where Ezra says something. I never thought about it before, but the Jedi were purged, the clones were decommissioned, and the droids were shut down. Who won the Clone Wars? The Clone Wars just kind of ended. Now, the Clone Wars were so devastating that it's no surprise that no one really thought about that back in the day. And the propaganda machine probably says that the new galactic empire was responsible for this stunning victory where the Republic had failed for so many years. But if you really sit back and think about it, it's so obvious in hindsight that something was going on, that someone was manipulating this behind the scenes. And of course we know that that's true. But It then leads to the obvious statement: who won the Clone Wars? The Empire won the Clone Wars. Hang on, I'm looking at my notes here really quick, just making sure I'm not missing anything here. I only have two more things to talk about, it looks like. First of all, it's almost weird to me how the droids are generally treated as slightly more threatening or dangerous than the Empire in this episode. Now, that's because the Empire usually treated as incompetent, but the droids were pretty incompetent too, so I find it interesting the way they're going with that. And of course, we have another enemy mine scenario, which actually works pretty well for the same reason it usually does, although it's a bit more truncated for my tastes. But I do like Rex's comments to Ezra. You managed to end the Clone Wars where nobody else did. Not because of a battle or winning or fighting, because you actually found legitimate common ground. It is an irony to me because I'm pretty sure that if it was somehow within capacity for enough leaders of both sides to meet, that this would have happened. In fact, if you remember, in both the books and the shows set during the Clone Wars, there were quite a few attempts by both sides to reach out to each other, and consistently the machinations of Dooku and Palpatine were in the way, trying to make sure that didn't happen. I sometimes like to picture that a lot of their spare time, when they're not, doing their obvious roles, was spent trying to make sure that this war was perpetuated, when honestly it probably shouldn't have been. Anyways. And the final note I wanted to mention is this is yet another person who decides not to join the rebellion because of a lack of chance of victory. I know this is going to sound weird, but I actually regret that. As much as I make fun of the battle droids, every now and again they actually made me grin, or even laugh. And it would have been kind of neat to have, some battle droids built into the rebellion. Ignoring the obvious parallels and thematic significance that would mean, it would also kind of go along with the whole we are stronger together mentality that the Rebel Alliance has always had, and Star Wars in general has always had. Oh well, I get why they didn't. I mean, they didn't have droids in the Rebel Alliance or in the original trilogy, so we got to adhere to that. I get it. Regardless, hope you've enjoyed. I'll see you next time.